Dr. Horne has written extensively. Recently, I read some book reviews that he published in the Jewish Affairs. They are excellent reviews. Dr. Horne teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's the head of the Black Studies Committee. Dr. Horne is running right now on the Peace and Freedom Party, and we are going to give him a hand. We are going to help him as much as possible because he's the right kind of a guy. On the question of racism, I don't believe that anybody that we have ever had at our forum, I don't believe we have had anybody over here that was so intense and so knowledgeable and so active in the fight against racism. And he's going to talk tonight about it, especially in relation to the fact that we are in a multiracial community, which Los Angeles is. My friends, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Horne. Take it over. Here's the little gimmick. I don't know what it does, but take it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. The office that I'm running for is the U.S. Senate, the Seymour seat. Boxer is running for the Cranston seat. So there's no contradiction. You can vote for both, or you can vote for neither one, for that matter. And it's on the Peace and Freedom Party primary. So if any of you who are signed up as P&F registrants, we'd certainly appreciate your taking an intense and close look at our campaign. But in any case, that's not why I'm here this evening. I'm here this evening, as you know, to talk about the question of racism. And in talking about the question of racism in California, quite frankly, there's no better place to start than with a gentleman I'm sure you're all too familiar with, and that's Ronald Wilson Reagan. Ronald Wilson Reagan, of course, was a governor of this state who almost bankrupted this state and then took his act to Washington, where he virtually succeeded in bankrupting the United States. We're familiar, I'm sure, with the details of his life in terms of his migrating from Illinois, in terms of his being a radio broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs and recreating scenes that were not taking place, in terms of his career as a B-movie actor. And of course, the last role that he had as an actor before he left for politics, I think, is quite instructive. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Killers. Well, this was Ronald Wilson Reagan's last movie role. And you know that up until that point, he had played the role of something of a good guy. And of course, this is what helped him, unfortunately, with the U.S. electorate in terms of getting elected president and elected governor, because people saw him as a good guy on the big screen and they felt that he would be a good guy in office. But it's interesting that the last role that he had as an actor was in a movie called The Killers, where he played a killer. A bloodthirsty, sneering, sniveling killer. I think this is very instructive because once he got into office, of course, what we saw was the smile being wiped away and that being replaced by a scowl against the people. It's also interesting as well when one looks at the career of Ronald Wilson Reagan to recognize how his career was so intimately bound up with labor management relations in Southern California. Now, you know, of course, that he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. You know that he started off as a New Deal type liberal, and then after the Cold War got underway, he flip-flopped and became a snitch for the FBI against his former comrades in the Screen Actors Guild. And I'm sure some of you might even recall the big post-World War II strikes that gripped the film industry here in Southern California, and that basically led to the ouster of progressive and left-wing leadership in the unions in the movie industry, and led to the rise of a number of right-wing led unions. And of course, some of these unions in the movie industry are still led by the right wing. And of course, Ronald Wilson Reagan played a very critical and essential role in that process. But what's also interesting about this is how the unions were defeated during those strikes after World War II in Los Angeles and Southern California. Basically, the bosses were able to enlist organized crime as a sort of a goon squad and a sort of intimidation squad, and that was very helpful and very useful, needless to say, in beating back the progressive unions. And that basically was a continuation of a pattern, because as you probably know, like too many industries in this country, the film industry in the United States historically has been closely linked and tied to what we call organized crime. It's something of a well-kept secret in many circles, but I'm sure it's not a secret in these circles. There's a book by Dan Modea called Dark Victory, Reagan, MCA, and the Mob, that goes into that in some detail. And then there's a recent book by the LA Times reporter Ronald Brownstein, The Power and the Glitter, that also talks about this to some extent. But what's interesting is how Ronald Wilson Reagan, of course, works with organized crime in terms of his union position. And then in this book, Dark Victory, what the author tries to suggest is the tie between Reagan and organized crime deepening once he gets into office. This is relevant to our theme because, as we know, organized crime is not an equal opportunity employer. They tend to take even more racist positions than traditional employers do. But this tie with organized crime, it seems to me at least, tended to give even more of a hostile edge to the traditional racism that often flows from the White House. For example, let's look at Ronald Wilson Reagan's policies that led directly to the election of George Bush in 1988. You recall that he started this campaign for president in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Philadelphia, Mississippi, of course, being the place where the civil rights martyrs, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, were murdered by the police and Klan in 1964 in protest, in their minds, against the upsurge of the civil rights movement. By going to Philadelphia, Mississippi to start his campaign, Reagan was basically sending a signal to the ultra-rightists, to the racists, that it was okay to become more bold, okay to become more vigorous in terms of their attempts to stave off civil rights protests. But this was just a symbol in a sense. But Ronald Wilson Reagan's policies were more than symbolic. They were also real. Note, of course, his effort to block the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the extension of that act. Now, of course, we were able to beat that back, but it wasted a lot of political capital on our part and a lot of energy on our part that we could have been using for other kinds of ends. Plus, once again, it sent a signal to the racist right, the Klan right, etc., that their activities had a certain kind of bona fide character to it. That wasn't all. Recall his effort to give a tax exemption to the Bob Jones University in South Carolina, one of the segregationist academies that preaches the doctrines of white supremacy, which is bad enough, but Ronald Wilson Reagan, as president, was going to give them a tax exemption so that basically we would be subsidizing their white supremacy and subsidizing their efforts to tighten the noose around our collective necks. Recall his effort to prevent the King holiday from taking place. Now, it wasn't enough for Reagan to try to keep that from taking place. He also sought to link Martin Luther King to the Communist Party and saying that we would know when these files were opened in maybe the year 2025 whether or not that was actually the case. Recall his effort to veto sanctions against South Africa. Now, we all know about that hateful apartheid regime, which Ronald Wilson Reagan, despite all of his ministrations and huffing and puffing about the so-called evil empire, as he called it, and human rights violations, real and imagined there. But when it came to human rights violations in South Africa against darker people, against people of African descent, Ronald Wilson Reagan was talking about constructive engagement, not calling South Africa, for example, an evil empire. So we see that the policies of Reagan led directly to smoothing the path for the election of his running mate, George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, George Bush, there are some good things to say about George Bush. Now, don't ask me to go into detail, but one thing I can say that's positive about George Bush is that when he was campaigning against Reagan in 1980 for the Republican nod for president, he was very explicit in calling Reagan's plan, or so-called supply-side economics plan, where you would cut taxes for the wealthy, raise taxes for everyone else through Social Security taxes. Look on your pay stub, you'll see Social Security taxes have gone out of the ceiling since 1980. And supposedly that would lead us into some sort of economic Shangri-La. Now, Bush, to his credit, called that voodoo economics. Now, the only thing I would say about that's an insult, quite frankly, and I mean this in all seriousness, to voodoo. But I think the point that he was trying to bring across, which I'm sure that we can all agree, that this was no more than a shell game, a sleight of hand, to once again redistribute the wealth from bottom to top. Well, I wish that George Bush would go back and review his campaign remarks of 1980, because when you look at what he's doing today, he's just continuing those very same policies, and I'll get to that in a bit more detail in a moment. But let's look at George Bush's record on race. You recall that as a congressman from Houston, he did not support the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, this Civil Rights Act, of course, has become the Magna Carta in terms of lifting some of the burden of discrimination off the shoulders of African Americans, Chicano Latinos, Asian Americans, women of all races and nationalities. Senior citizens have benefited from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in fact, by some studies and by some measures, the major beneficiary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its progeny, which includes the Age Discrimination Acts, would be white males over the age of 55. But this was an act that was opposed by George Bush when he was in Congress. Then, of course, when he ran for president in 1988, he compounded the sin, he compounded the error by using this symbol of Willie Horton, by playing the race card. Willie Horton, you might recall, was this Afro-American prisoner who was released under a work release program and then committed some crimes. Well, as Lee Atwater, the late campaign manager of Bush, suggested at that point, the GOP in 1988 sought to make the voters think that Willie Horton was the running mate of Michael Dukakis. In other words, they were playing upon some very visceral and I'm afraid very deeply rooted sentiments in the United States that tends to view with fear and apprehension black males, and particularly, as the history of lynching shows, tends to see any kind of relationship, whether violent or consensual or whatever, between white women and black males as something that's particularly verboten. Now, it's very interesting that George Bush used the Willie Horton card in 1988 because in 1991, just a few months ago, he nominated Clarence Thomas, an Afro-American lawyer and judge, to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, I'm sure you must have seen the hearings that took place, the Thomas Hill hearings. What was interesting about that was that Clarence Thomas charged the Senate Judiciary Committee with the crime of engaging in a high-tech lynching. And he said that he was an uppity Negro who was being called to book by these white males that were standing before him, and that they had a particular pleasure in examining the sexuality of a black male. Now, that was very interesting that Clarence Thomas would say that, because it was his patron, George Herbert Walker Bush, that did that very same thing with the Willie Horton symbol in the election campaign of 1988. But this Clarence Thomas nomination, I think, says volumes about George Bush's strategy with regard to race. Basically, what it appears that Bush and the GOP are trying to do on the question of race is to make many white workers, Euro-American workers, feel that in this time of economic recession / depression, that their job is about to be taken away by a person of color, particularly a black person. You may recall the commercial that Senator Jesse Helms used in the North Carolina senatorial race in 1990 against his Afro-American challenger, Harvey Gantt. A few weeks before the election was to take place, Harvey Gantt was within a few percentage points of Helms in the polls, if not surging ahead. At that time, Helms deluged the North Carolina television stations with commercials showing a white worker coming home, opening his mail. The letter reads that you've just been laid off. The voice-over narration says you had to relinquish your job because quotas meant that an inferior black worker by law had to take your job, which is ludicrous. That doesn't happen in the USA, trust me. But this very dastardly commercial was quite effective in helping to stampede a significant percentage of the North Carolina electorate into running into the voting booth and voting for Jesse Helms, and now he's a U.S. Senator continuing to harass every progressive movement in the country. But that's not all in terms of what the Republicans and Bush are trying to do in 1991 and in the near future with regard to race. That's not all. They also have this strategy where they, on the one hand, bash affirmative action, bash this fictitious issue of quotas, trying to intimidate and stampede white workers. On the other hand, they're pursuing it. Clarence Thomas was an affirmative action appointment. Indeed, you could even say he was a quota appointment. He was appointed to the black seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. To a certain extent, Colin Powell was an affirmative action appointment. George Bush leapfrogged Colin Powell over a number of other generals who were in line to become head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he appointed Colin Powell. It's not to say that Colin Powell was unqualified. Apparently, he's as bloodthirsty as the rest of them. But certainly, you can characterize it as an affirmative action appointment. So what Bush is trying to do is, on the one hand, bash affirmative action, and therefore intimidate the liberals, the progressives, and the Democrats away from the question of affirmative action. On the other hand, he's pursuing it. And by pursuing it, what he's trying to do is lop off perhaps 10 to 15% of the black vote and the vote of people of color in general. Those blacks, for example, who might be like Clarence Thomas or have some sort of material benefit as they see it in their own minds in terms of voting GOP. So he's rewarding these people on the one hand through affirmative action policy while trying to intimidate many progressives from pursuing affirmative action. And I'm afraid, quite frankly, my friends, that strategy is having some impact. And let me give you one example before I go a step further. You read in the left, and well, not on all left presses, but in many progressive newspapers and in terms of certain things you hear on KPFK, about how what the left and progressives should do is pursue universal programs, you see. Healthcare is often given as an example, because if you play up too much the question of anti-racism, well then the white voters get scared because they see affirmative action quotas, etc. And so you don't want to talk about racism. You want to talk about universal programs that encompasses people of different nationalities. Well, I'm all in favor of a national health care system, as I'm sure you are as well. And I'm all in favor of universal programs. But I think, my friends, that we have to recognize that even if we have universal programs, there's still going to be a need to fight racism. For example, a recent study showed that in terms of getting organ transplants, heart and kidney transplants, that blacks were at the bottom of the list. In terms of getting treated in emergency rooms of hospitals, they're at the bottom of the list. So what are we supposed to do? Not fight that kind of racism just because we have a universal program? Even after a universal program of universal health care is passed, there will still be a need to fight racism within the health care system. I'm afraid, brothers and sisters, that although it's a very bitter struggle and a very difficult struggle, there's really no alternative to confronting the question of racism. And I think that we are ill-served if we follow President Bush's strategy of divide and conquer, his strategy of trying to intimidate the progressive movement away from supporting affirmative action. And shortly I'll talk a bit about affirmative action and some of the mythology surrounding it. But let me say at this point that what George Bush has done, of course, is set an example that now is being emulated today in our state of California by Pete Wilson and by John Seymour, my alleged opponent in the U.S. Senate race of November 1992. Now, you know about this initiative that Pete Wilson is formulating for the November 92 ballot. It's going to slash welfare. Pete Wilson, as a run-up to that, has been bashing immigrants. What is the problem with the state of California? Why is the economy of the state of California in recession and depression? Is it because of the rich and the wealthy getting too much, taking more than they deserve? No. The reason, says Pete Wilson, is because of welfare. Because welfare costs are spiraling, and that's what's causing taxes to go up. And so if we want to get the state of California back into good health, well, what we need to do is cut off welfare. Now, this is very interesting because, once again, he's walking in the footsteps of Ronald Wilson Reagan. You might recall Reagan's image of the welfare queen. Not only a misogynist, anti-woman image, but also a racist image, because she's all usually characterized, at least in the popular imagination, as being a black woman. And he used to tell the story about how she would go into the grocery store with her food stamps and buy vodka, or buy some food item and get the change back and buy vodka. Now, this is ludicrous. This does not happen. It's one more of Reagan's fictions, Bush's fictions, like calling ketchup a vegetable, for example. But this is the card, this is the game that Pete Wilson is trying to run on the voters. But once again, he has a hidden agenda, a not too thinly veiled agenda. Because if you look at the proposition that Wilson is putting before the voters, or he intends to put before the voters in November 1992, it not only slashes welfare back to 19th century standards, it also provides the governor with virtual dictatorial powers whenever there's a budget impasse in the state. Yes, ma'am.
Is Proposition X?
I forgot the designation, but it was just reported in the LA Times maybe last week. He's just being formulated. Now, what he's trying to do is provide to the voters something that he feels they can nibble on. You know, this anti-welfare mentality, which he feels they'll go for, playing on these racist sentiments. But then the door gets shut behind them once they nibble on that, because if this anti-welfare proviso passes, you'll have a governor of the state of California that has virtual dictatorial powers. And my friends, with the rise of the ultra-right in the United States, David Duke, with the rise in France, Jean Le Pen, with Nazis throwing Mozambicans out of windows in the former German Democratic Republic, with the Japanese foreign ministry telling Japanese tourists in Prague to wear business suits in downtown Prague, otherwise they'll be mistaken for Vietnamese refugees and might get beat up. With this rising tide of racism, not only in the United States, but globally, when a governor of California starts talking about getting dictatorial powers and then using a racist carrot to entice the voters in that direction, I think it's time that we heighten our activity and raise our voices a bit more loudly. Now, Reagan, Bush, Wilson, Seymour, they've all prepared the path for David Duke. As Dan Quayle said on a recent TV news show, Dan Quayle said that we don't disagree with the message of David Duke, we just disagree with the messenger. That's what he said on This Week with David Brinkley a few weeks ago. And actually, there's something to what Dan Quayle says, because if you look at David Duke's message, anti-welfare, anti-immigrant, Japan bashing, it's not that far from the traditional Republican Party message And so in a sense, it's appropriate that he's running in the Republican Party primary for President of the United States. It's appropriate in a sense that he and George Bush will have to share the same platform, the same podium, because they share many of the same ideas. George Bush's racism is of the pinstripe variety. David Duke's racism is a bit more rough-hewn, but they are basically putting forth the same message. And my friends, it has to be quite disturbing once again when we see that but for a massive turnout of African American voters, David Duke would have become governor by a very comfortable margin. David Duke won the majority of the non-black vote in the state of Louisiana, and we would have had a situation where you had a man not too far from the Klan, a man not too far from Nazi Party membership, or at least affinities, who would have been controlling the state police and the National Guard of Louisiana. If that was not a fire bell in the night, arousing us from our slumber, I don't know what is. My friends, things right now are a bit more dicey than they may have been in the recent past. We know that at least since the end of World War II, the Republican Party, Reagan, Bush, etc., they basically had two tools that they've used to bludgeon the electorate. One is anti-communism, the other was racism. Well, for reasons that I'm sure I do not have to go into in any detail, at least with this audience, the anti-communist card does not have the resonance that it once had. That tends to increase the premium, increase the value in their minds of the racism card. And thus we see that just as in the past, the people of the United States was told their major task was to fight communists at home and communists abroad. Now it seems that we are being told that our enemy is people of color at home and people of color abroad, with the latter being Japan. Now, I don't know how many of you saw Nightline last night. They had the focus on the layoffs at General Motors. Draconian layoffs, an absolute disaster, coming in the wake of massive layoffs at IBM, Xerox, the so-called blue chip corporation sending workers into the streets in droves. It's very interesting that they interviewed 3 workers, and Ted Koppel, who was handling the interviewing task, was asking these very leading questions. In describing the plight of General Motors and how it got to this point where it's losing, allegedly and apparently, millions of dollars a day, did he blame management? No. He sought to blame 2 forces. The workers themselves, who he said where he was suggesting or at least intimating had not taken enough concessions, that perhaps their wages were inflated. Of course, the workers who were being interviewed pointed out that actually wages in Japan and many other countries are higher than they are in the United States. The United States is becoming like the low-wage leader when it comes to industrial nations. Ted Koppel was directing the argument in a way that people would think that the reason, the sole reason, other than the workers, that General Motors has fallen on such hard times is because of Japan. It's because of these alleged sneaky tactics of Tokyo that has led to this situation. Now, President Bush, as you know, is going to Japan in a few weeks, taking all these corporate executives with him, including Lee Iacocca, Japan basher #1. And Lee Iacocca says he's going there with a crowbar, and he's going to use the crowbar to pry open the markets of Japan. But my friends, this is a very dangerous situation that we're getting into when the international situation is becoming as racialized as the domestic situation. I need only point to you what happened to Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was the Chinese American who was set upon by laid off white auto workers in Michigan a few years back. They bashed him to death. They saw him as a symbol of the Japanese auto industry, even though he had never been to Japan and in fact was Chinese American. It's that kind of racialized situation that can lead to the kinds of tragedies that befell Vincent Chin. It's particularly important in this state because you cannot talk about the question of race in California without talking about this state's long history of anti-Asian bias. Back in the 19th century, you had this working men's party based in the city of San Francisco, which was at that time the most populous city in the state, led by Dennis Kearney, which had one of its, as its major planks in its platform, anti-Asian bias, anti-Japanese, but particularly anti-Chinese bias at that particular time in history. I need not remind you, I'm sure, about what happened in this city of Los Angeles in late 1941 and early 1942. After the World War started, after the United States entered World War II, more precisely, Japanese Americans were rounded up, interned, put in concentration camps. No such plight befell German Americans or Italian Americans to the same degree, although the United States was in a war with them too. So I think that in the state of California, we in particular have to be on our guard when we see those images of 50 years ago once again raising their ugly head. And I was very disturbed to read in the Los Angeles Times that on December 7th, just a few days ago, many people in Little Tokyo decided to stay inside because they felt that if they even ventured outside of their doors in their neighborhoods, they would have been set upon. My friends, this is a very dangerous situation when it comes to the question of race, when it comes to the question of democratic rights, because we need to be clear. If anti-Asian bias and prejudice goes up, well then anti-black bias and prejudice goes up, anti-Jewish bias and prejudice goes up, anti-woman bias and prejudice goes up. Indeed, it becomes a disaster for all except that thin elite who runs this country. But not only is this sort of situation dangerous on the question of race, it's also inaccurate. Let me give you a few brief points on what led to the rise of the Japanese auto industry and how that was assisted by the United States. On June 24th, 1950, the head of Toyota landed in Los Angeles. His automobile company, Toyota, was ravaged by the war. This was 1950, 5 years after the massive bombings, fire bombings of Tokyo, the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At that time, and some of the old timers in the audience might recall this, made in Japan was almost like a laugh that was meant to signify something being cheap and would break within a week. But he was coming here, this head of Toyota, to try to pump up sales for his cars. Well, what happens? June 25th, 1950, Korean War breaks out. The United States starts pouring war orders into Toyota for military vehicles. Toyota gets a shot in the arm. Same things happens during the Vietnam War. Toyota then, of course, arises. What else happens? When the oil embargo of 1973 begins, the U.S. auto industry is reluctant to build small cars, reluctant to build fuel-efficient cars. It takes an act of Congress to force the U.S. auto industry to build smaller cars. They said that the consumers wanted these dinosaurs with these fins that took 30 seconds to turn a corner. Well, they were wrong. That also gave a shot in the arm to the Japanese auto industry. So if you want to look at what happened to the U.S. auto industry, well, let's look at home. Let's look at the boardrooms in Detroit before we look in the boardrooms of Tokyo. Now, I'm willing to look in the boardrooms in Tokyo, but let's look in the boardrooms of Detroit first and put the blame where it belongs. Now, needless to say, this racialized situation not only has an international component, and has a domestic component. And let me bring you to a point that I said I was going to talk about, and that's the attack on affirmative action. Affirmative action, as you know, is the effort to include those who have been previously excluded. Let me give you an example of affirmative action. I don't know how many of you are baseball fans, but Al Campanis, who used to be an executive with the LA Dodgers, a few years ago caused a flap. I don't know how many of you recall that, when he said that Afro-Americans did not have the necessities to be baseball managers. And that caused the Major League Baseball executives to engage in what they considered a plan to increase the number of baseball managers, because obviously blacks know how to play baseball. I mean, look at the statistics in terms of who's hitting home runs, I mean, who's stealing bases. I mean, if they understand the game well enough to perform well, you think they would understand the game well enough to manage. Well, still, you have a dearth of black managers in baseball. Hal McRae of the Kansas City Royals is one. Can anybody name another? You had perhaps 10 to 14 positions opened up in Major League Baseball in terms of managerial positions just within the last year or so. The same old guys, non-black, mostly white, almost all white, get the positions. Now, affirmative action would mean that those black managerial candidates would get more of a consideration. And why shouldn't they? They're qualified. Because racism is keeping them out of the dugout, and affirmative action is designed to get them into the dugout. Now, one has to be for affirmative action unless you say that there's a divine right of these white guys to manage all Major League Baseball teams, and there should be no one else who does it. The only way to get around that roadblock is through affirmative action. And that brings me to one of the major arguments against affirmative action, which is the argument, allegedly, of merit. We're told that affirmative action overrides the question of merit. Now, I find this very curious. We know that most positions in the United States, or not most, many, depend not on what you know, but who you know. It depends on whether or not you have a relative in the work site or some sort of connection in the work site. Look at appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court. Are those going on the basis of merit? If so, Clarence Thomas certainly would not have been nominated, nor would David Souter have been nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. Look at how judges are nominated in the state of New York or in the state of California. Oftentimes it's through some sort of personal relationship with the governor or some other politician. My friends, meritocracy, when it's raised to blunt the affirmative action thrust, is basically a red herring. It's a canard. It's a falsehood. Because affirmative action, as my baseball analogy example shows, does not override the question of merit. In fact, it gets into the door those whose merit would have been otherwise ignored. And then they talk about the question of testing when it comes to affirmative action, particularly when it comes to admission to institutions of higher education. Now, so many studies have shown, and there was just a report in the New York Times just the other day, that the standardized tests have a wealth bias. That is to say, if you can afford to take a preparatory exam, and Stanley Kaplan is one, they advertise in many of the newspapers. They're very expensive. If you can afford to take this preparatory exam before you take the Scholastic Aptitude Test or the Law School Admissions Test or one of these other standardized tests, you can score up to 100 points more than you would if you had not taken the Kaplan test. Now, what does that mean? That means that these tests are not measuring aptitude necessarily. They're measuring the size of your pocketbook. Because if you can pay your money to take this test, then you do better. And therefore, the poor, who are disproportionately people of color, are thereby discriminated against and thereby kept from the halls of learning. So you cannot use the question of testing credibly to blunt affirmative action. Another thing I find very curious when you talk about affirmative action in higher education, nobody talks about other forms of affirmative action. Take Stanford University in the state of California, a so-called prestigious university. Now, if you went to Stanford University, your sons and daughters will have a better chance of getting into that university than, say, my sons and daughters, because I did not go to Stanford University. In other words, there's a sort of points that are given for alums. And then, of course, since Stanford pursued a discriminatory policy all these years, that means that more often than not, the alums of Stanford will not be people of color. And so that's a rather thinly veiled way to give affirmative action to non-blacks, non-minorities. Take the recent flap, the recent controversy over race-based scholarships. You recall what happened just about a year ago. An Afro-American Assistant Secretary of Education, Michael Williams, said he was going to throw out race-based scholarships. They were against the law. Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander came in and tried to clean it up and basically said, well, they might be against the law, but race can be used as a factor. But he was trying to suggest that race-based scholarships were illegal. Now, a reporter in the audience asked him, he said, Secretary Alexander, you're from the state of Tennessee. In fact, you were governor of Tennessee. Did you know that at Vanderbilt University, this so-called prestigious university in your state, that there are scholarships specifically designated for the descendants of those who fought with the Confederate Army? Now, that's obviously race-based, as I'm sure you can see. Would those be illegal? Of course not. They're not illegal. And of course, we all know that donors set up scholarships aimed at Armenian students, aimed at women students, aimed at Jewish students. But because they were trying to play the race card, and because they were trying to play upon decades and centuries of resentment and hostility against Afro-Americans in particular, they singled out race-based, which is codes for singling out blacks. It's also curious that when we talk about affirmative action and these so-called programs of preference, well, there are all sorts of programs of preference. What about veterans' preference? What about veterans' hospitals? What about veterans' preference when it comes to getting mortgages? I'm not opposed to it, but it seems to me if you're saying that there must be merit at all times, which I've just shown is a fraudulent argument in any case, but let's assume that it's not, but then you only focus on affirmative action when it comes to blacks, but you don't focus on these other programs, I have to ask questions. And this doesn't even raise the threshold question about affirmative action, which is that if you look at the most significant beneficiaries of affirmative action, it's mostly non-minority women, which is fair because non-minority women have a majority in this country, if not a plurality. So it's understandable why they would be the most significant beneficiaries of affirmative action. But when you talk about affirmative action, you would think that only black people get affirmative action, when in fact it's non-minority women, it's Asian Americans, it's Chicano Latinos, etc. It's Native American Indians, etc. But my friends, the only kind of delicious irony that I can see, and I must admit it's quite attenuated, in terms of this whole flap about race and racism and playing the race card that the Republicans have done and the elites of this country have played for oh so many years, is that it's dragging the country down. They have this idea that now that anti-communism has declined in terms of potency, they can play the race card and continue in power. The Republicans can't. What else do they have left? They have no plan for the economy besides cutting more taxes on the wealthy, and that's what's got us into this pickle in the first place. But they still have this potent race card. But my friends, the fact of the matter is that the new ball game is economic competition. And economic competition requires an educated workforce. Look at our state of California. The minorities are becoming the majority. If we consign all of these national minorities to a fate of deprived and disadvantaged education, we're basically consigning the state to a situation where it is deprived and disadvantaged. It won't be able to compete, and it will drag down not only the minorities, it'll drag down other people who don't happen to be in the minority. So we see that the Republican Party and those elites who back them, by encouraging them to play the race card, are basically cutting the economic throat of this country, and it's up to us to stop them. Now, I don't want to seem wildly optimistic, but I should point out to you that in the New York Times, I believe it was about a week ago, perhaps December 12th or December 13th, in the business section, former Secretary of State George Shultz was interviewed. And if you were to read this interview, you would be shocked. You'd have to sit down before you read it. Because what does George Shultz say? This former Nixon and Reagan administration cabinet official, this present executive in Bechtel Corporation, one of the major corporations in this state, what does he say? He says that the problem with the United States right now is that the right wing has too much power. He says that one of the problems in terms of this recession come depression is that there has been a beating down of purchasing power. of the masses of the people, and that people don't have the money to buy the real estate, the cars, the clothes, the food, and that's a contributing factor to the recession. So George Shultz says that even though even though he says that in his own corporation, Bechtel, he tries to keep unions out. He says in other corporations they should try to bring unions in because that'll help to bring up the wages, which will help to get the United States out of this depression. This is very interesting. First of all, a right-winger like Shultz would come to this conclusion. That shows you how dire the situation is when right-wing Reaganites are talking about bringing in unions in other people's corporations. He hasn't gotten to the point where he said bring it into his corporation. But it's also revealing because it shows the damage that the Republicans and the right wing have done by beating down the government and beating down the state administration by telling people that government is the problem. Because in ruling class parlance, the state based in Washington, D.C. is the executive committee for the class that rules this country. And so it's supposed to be a bit more far-sighted than the different various capitalists who it's representing. So it can act in its interests and therefore maybe pass a law that allows unions to come into shops so the shops can be organized so people can have money so they can buy things and so the recession can be lifted. But the Republicans have done such a good job of beating down the union and beating down the state and making the state seem illegitimate, that when the time comes for the state to act in their interests, it's very difficult for the state to even act in their interests, not to mention acting in our interests, which of course it rarely does. And that illustrates the dilemma in which the Republicans find themselves. Quite frankly, what's happened is that their policies have worked all too well. That is to say, they've beaten down the unions. The unions are about, 15% or less of the labor force in this country. They've driven up the debt, so it's very difficult to pursue the kinds of prime-pumping Keynesian programs that are traditionally used to bring the United States economy out of recession. And, of course, they played the race card to a fairly well, despite the fact that in states like California, we need programs like affirmative action to help bring the state out of its present economic torpor. Let me conclude by saying that, as I mentioned a few moments ago, there are those who would suggest to us that what we need to do is ignore the question of race and racism because it makes people uncomfortable. It makes people think that blacks are getting special benefits that others don't get, and then they go out and vote Republican. They say that what we should do is pursue universalist programs. Well, let me just cite to you a few studies that show the continued pervasiveness of racism in U.S. society, and then ask the question plaintively, what is to be done about this continuing and pervasive racism? Are we supposed to just shut up and get lost and take the racism? Or are we supposed to pursue antidotes like affirmative action to rid ourselves of this pestilence? A recent study showed that when it came to getting mortgages, people of color, particularly Afro-Americans, were treated in a discriminatory fashion. I already suggested to you the study about organ transplants. When it comes to car sales, it seems that car salesmen and car salesmen oftentimes discriminate against blacks who come into the showroom to buy an auto. They get worse deals. So if you're black and you want to buy a car, you should do what they used to do some years ago if you wanted to buy a house in a previously segregated neighborhood. You'd send a white friend in to make the deal, and then you'd move in and surprise your neighbors. Well, you might have to do that in 1991 with regard to buying a car even. With regard to shopping, I don't know how many of you saw a few months ago this special on ABC television where they showed an Afro-American and a Euro-American male who were dressed similarly, had a similar sort of articulation of the kinds of similar qualities, both going into retail stores, department stores. You know, the Afro-American male is treated like a criminal on the loose. I mean, the sales clerks do everything except wrestle him to the floor and handcuff his ankles to his wrists. Whereas the Euro-American male, of course, gets the kind of treatment that one would expect a paying customer to receive. What about the death penalty? Not only are a disproportionate number of Afro-Americans on death row, and that's been the case for as long as I can remember, not only is that the case, but one is more likely, strike that, one is less likely to receive the death penalty if one murders an Afro-American than if one murders one of European descent, irrespective of the race and nationality of the perpetrator. That means that if this woman here suddenly just decided that life in the world was too much and she wanted to leave this planet and take both of us with her, if she gets up and shoots me and shoots him, she'll get the death penalty for shooting him, but not for shooting me, which, in my mind at least, doesn't seem fair. But in any case, my friends, I've probably gone on a little too long, but let me just conclude by saying I'd like to thank all of you for coming here this evening, taking time on this gusty Thursday evening to share some moments with us, and also to alert you to the fact that we are running in the Peace and Freedom Party primary for U.S. Senate against John Seymour, the Republican incumbent, and that either we'd hope you would give us some consideration in the primary and certainly give us very strong consideration in November 1992. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to a program distributed by the Pacifica Radio Archive. For a copy or catalog of Pacifica tapes, write to Pacifica, Box 8092, Department R, Universal City, California, 91608. That's Box 8092, Department R, Universal City, California, 91608. To order by credit card, call toll-free 800-735-0230. That's 800-735-0230.